For decades before World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy AIJN was obsessed with a single, glorious idea. They called it Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The plan was simple, elegant, and totally rooted in the past. In the event of war with the United States, the Japanese Navy would lure the American Pacific Fleet across the ocean. As the Americans steamed west, they would be whittled down by Japanese submarines and land-based bombers. Finally, somewhere near Japan, the two great fleets would meet in a titanic clash. And in this battle, the Japanese believed the battleship would be king. They poured their national resources into building the ultimate weapons for this fight: the Yamato and her sister ship, the Musashi. These were the largest, most heavily armored, and most powerful battleships ever built. Their 18-inch guns could hurl a shell weighing as much as a car over 20 miles. The Japanese admirals revered these ships. They were the physical embodiment of the samurai spirit, supersized and invincible. To the old guard admirals in Tokyo, the aircraft carrier was a useful tool, a scouting vessel, perhaps a way to harass the enemy. But it was not the ship that would win the war. Carriers were fragile. Their decks were made of wood. One good hit from a battleship shell would crack them open like an egg. The Japanese Navy was preparing for a rerun of the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where they had decisively defeated the Russian Navy in a gunnery duel. They were preparing for a 19th-century battle with 20th-century technology. And this obsession with the big gun blinded them to the true revolution that was happening on their own flight decks. While the older admirals dreamed of battleship duels, a new kind of power had been forged in the Imperial Navy. The Kido Butai, the mobile force. This was the first air fleet, a concentration of 6 heavy aircraft carriers that was, in 1941, the most powerful naval striking force on Earth. No other nation had brought together so many carriers into a single tactical unit. Their air crews were the elite of the elite. Japanese naval pilots trained for years. Their selection process was brutally competitive. Only the very best, the most skilled flyers, made it to the carrier decks. They had thousands of hours of flight time. They were masters of navigation, formation flying, and gunnery. And they flew the Mitsubishi A6M0. In 1941, the Zero was the best carrier-based fighter in the world. It was fast, incredibly maneuverable, and had tremendous range. At Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai proved its devastating potential. They achieved complete surprise, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleship force in a single morning. For the next 6 months, they rampaged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. They struck at Wake Island, in the Dutch East Indies, in Australia, Darwin, and all the way to Ceylon, Sri Lanka. They were unstoppable. They sank ships, destroyed bases, and shot down Allied planes with frightening ease. They had never been defeated. This string of victories created a sense of absolute invincibility among the Japanese carrier crews and their commanders. They believed they were the samurai of the sky, and no Western pilot could touch them. This confidence, born of skill and success, would soon curdle into a dangerous arrogance. They began to believe their own propaganda. They thought they were unbeatable. And that is a very dangerous thing to believe in war. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese High Command held the United States Navy in utter contempt. They had sunk their battleships at Pearl Harbor. They had pushed them out of the Western Pacific. When they thought of the remaining American forces, they focused on the carriers, the two flat-tops, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. To the Japanese admirals, these ships were inferior copies of their own magnificent carriers. They mocked their construction. They believed American damage control was poor, that their crews were soft and untrained. They had a particularly low opinion of American pilots. Japanese reports described U.S. pilots as amateurs, lacking the discipline and fighting spirit of the Japanese aviator. They pointed to the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. Although the battle was a strategic draw, the Japanese pilots had inflicted heavy damage. They sank the carrier Lexington and severely damaged the Yorktown. The Japanese admirals were convinced they had sunk the Yorktown as well. They celebrated, believing they had reduced the American carrier fleet to just 2 operational ships. They laughed at the idea that these few, inexperienced American carriers would dare to challenge the might of the Kido Butai. Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the carrier force, was a torpedo expert, not an aviator. He was cautious, but even he shared the general disdain for the enemy. He believed that if the Americans did show up, his Zeros would swat their planes from the sky, and his bombers would send their flat-tops to the bottom. It was a foregone conclusion. The Japanese were so confident in their superiority that they didn't even bother to upgrade their communication codes, believing them to be unbreakable. They were so sure of victory that they planned the next phase of the war assuming the American carriers were already destroyed. They were not preparing for a fair fight. They were preparing for a slaughter. Their mockery was not just bluster, it was a deep-seated belief in their own racial and martial superiority. And it was about to lead them into the greatest trap in naval history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was the architect of Pearl Harbor. He was a brilliant, complex man. Unlike many of his colleagues, he respected America's industrial power. He knew that a long war would be a disaster for Japan. He needed a knockout blow. He needed to destroy the American carriers. As long as those carriers existed, they were a threat. They had launched the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942, a psychological shock that proved Japan was vulnerable. Yamamoto decided to set a trap. The target would be Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost in the middle of the Pacific. His plan was unimaginably complex. It involved nearly the entire Japanese Navy, over 200 ships, spread across thousands of miles of ocean. One force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska as a diversion. Another force would invade Midway itself. But the real hammer was the Kido Butai, with 4 heavy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, waiting in ambush. Yamamoto reasoned that the Americans would have to come out to defend Midway. It was too important to lose. When the American fleet, which Yamamoto believed consisted of only 2 carriers, steamed out from Pearl Harbor to save the island, they would walk right into his trap. His battleships, including the mighty Yamato far to the rear, would be waiting to finish off whatever the carriers didn't sink. It was a classic Kantai-Kessen plan, updated for the carrier age. But it relied on one fatal assumption: surprise. Yamamoto assumed the Americans would be reacting blindly to his moves. He assumed they would be surprised by the attack on Midway. He assumed they wouldn't know where his carriers were. The entire plan was a house of cards built on the belief that the Americans were ignorant and incompetent. Yamamoto was a gambler. He was betting the entire war on one roll of the dice. He didn't know that the Americans were reading his mail. He didn't know that the inferior enemy knew exactly where he was going, when he would arrive, and how many ships he had. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The trap was set, but Yamamoto was the one walking into it. While Yamamoto moved his massive fleet across the Pacific in radio silence, confident in his invisibility, a group of disheveled men in a basement in Hawaii were watching him. This was Station Hypo. Located in the dungeon-like basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, it was the headquarters of the Combat Intelligence Unit. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. The men worked in their bathrobes and slippers, surviving on coffee and sandwiches. Leading them was Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was an eccentric genius. He spoke fluent Japanese. He understood the Japanese mind. For months, his team had been listening to the noise of the Imperial Navy's radio traffic. They had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25B. Not fully, only about 10% to 15% of the messages were readable, but it was enough to see the patterns. Rochefort noticed a surge in traffic. He saw references to a target designated AF. Washington intelligence believed AF was Fiji or the Aleutians. They thought Rochefort was crazy. They dismissed his warnings. But Rochefort was convinced AF was Midway. He devised a trap to prove it. He ordered the garrison at Midway to send an unencrypted radio message claiming their water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message: AF is short of fresh water. The trap had snapped shut. Rochefort had the target. But he gave Admiral Nimitz more than just the target. He gave him the date, June 4th or 5th. He gave him the direction of approach. He gave him the order of battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, had a decision to make. The Japanese had 4 heavy carriers, battleships, and cruisers. Nimitz had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which civilian workers had patched up in 72 hours of non-stop welding. If Rochefort was wrong, Nimitz would be sending his only remaining carriers into an ambush. He would lose the war in the Pacific. But Nimitz trusted his basement genius over the politicians in Washington. He issued the order. He sent his carriers to a spot on the map northeast of Midway, known as a Point Luck. They arrived there and waited. Silent. Hidden. Yamamoto was sailing to a surprise party where he was the guest of honor. The Japanese admirals were so confident in their secrecy that they broadcasted their intentions through the airwaves, never dreaming that the amateur Americans were reading their mail. It was the greatest intelligence coup in the history of naval warfare. While the Japanese officers sipped sake and toasted to the coming victory, the American pilots were already briefing in their ready rooms, studying the silhouette of the ships they were about to hunt. Dawn, June 4, 1942. The Japanese mobile force arrived off Midway. Admiral Nagumo launched his first wave of aircraft, 108 planes, to bomb the island's defenses. He held back a second wave on the flight decks. These planes were armed with torpedoes, ready to attack any American ships if they appeared. but Nagumo didn't expect any American ships. His scout planes, launched late due to catapult failures, reported nothing but empty ocean. The first wave struck Midway but reported that a second strike was needed to soften up the island. Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had torpedo bombers sitting on his decks. Torpedoes are for ships, they are useless against land targets. If he wanted to hit the island again, he had to switch the weapons. He hesitated. Then, he gave the fateful order, rearm with bombs. The hangars of the Akagi and Kaga turned into a madhouse. Mechanics frantically scrambled to lower the planes to the hangar deck. They stripped off the heavy torpedoes and began loading 800 kilograms land attack bombs. In the rush, they violated safety protocols. Instead of returning the torpedoes to the secure, armored magazines deep in the ship, they simply rolled them to the side of the hangar deck. Piles of high explosives began to accumulate next to fuel lines and fully fueled aircraft. The Japanese carriers were now floating powder kegs. Then, at 7:28 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported a sighting. 10 ships, apparently enemy. Nagumo froze. Ships? There weren't supposed to be ships. He asked for clarification. What ship types? Minutes tick by. Agonizing minutes. Finally, the report came back. Plane type looks like a carrier. The blood must have drained from Nagumo's face. He had been caught with his pants down. His planes were halfway through rearming. Some had bombs. Some had torpedoes. His fighter cover, Combat Air Patrol, was low on fuel and ammo from fighting off attacks from Midway. He reversed his order. Rearm with torpedoes. Chaos erupted again. Mechanics cursed as they had to take the bombs off and put the torpedoes back on. More explosives piled up on the decks. Nagumo decided to wait. He wanted to recover his first wave, which was returning low on fuel, then launch a massive, coordinated strike against the American carrier. He calculated he needed about 15 minutes to clear his decks and launch. He looked at the sky. It was clear. His Zero fighters were buzzing overhead, swatting away the few ineffective American attacks that had come so far. He felt he had weathered the storm. He was confident. He had the superior force. He just needed a few minutes to organize his punch. He didn't know that those 15 minutes would be the difference between empire and ruin. While Nagumo was shuffling his ordnance, the Americans were attacking. But it was a disjointed, chaotic attack. The American air groups had gotten separated in the clouds. The fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arrived at different times. First to arrive was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the USS Hornet. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, they were flying the TBD Devastator. The Devastator was a death trap. It was slow, obsolete, and had to fly low and straight to drop its torpedo. Waldron knew the odds. Before taking off, he told his men, "If there is only one plane left, I want that man to go in and get a hit." VT-8 found the Japanese fleet. They had no fighter escort. They were alone. Below them lay the might of the Kido Butai. For carriers, battleships, cruisers. And above them swarmed the Zeros. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, CAP, spotted the slow-moving American torpedo bombers. The Zeros dove from high altitude. It was a massacre. The TBDs were sluggish. They couldn't maneuver. One by one, they were shot out of the sky. Waldron was one of the first to die, his plane bursting into flames. The Japanese gunners on the ships put up a wall of steel. Of the 15 planes in Torpedo Squadron 8, all 15 were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. He crashed into the ocean and hid under a seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle from the water. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. To the Japanese, it looked like another pathetic American failure. They cheered as the burning planes hit the water. Is this the best they can do? Next came Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise. They were slaughtered too. Then Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown. They managed to drop a few torpedoes, but scored no hits. It seemed like a total disaster for the Americans. A waste of brave men and planes. But Torpedo 8 had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had achieved something crucial, something that would decide the fate of the war. To attack the low-flying torpedo bombers, the Japanese Zeros had been forced to descend to sea level. They were swarming right above the water, chasing the TBDs. They had burned up their ammunition. They had burned up their fuel. And critically, they had left the high altitude completely undefended. The Japanese eyes were all looking down, laughing at the burning torpedo planes. They didn't look up. And because they didn't look up, they didn't see what was coming out of the sun at 15,000 feet. High above the slaughter of the torpedo squadrons, 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers were lost. Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, was running on fumes. He had flown to the predicted intercept point, but the Japanese weren't there. Nagumo had turned north. McCluskey had a choice. Turn back to save his planes, or keep searching and risk ditching in the ocean. He decided to keep searching. At 9:55 a.m., he saw a white streak on the blue ocean. It was the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. It was rushing back to the main fleet after depth-charging an American submarine. McCluskey followed the wake. 10 minutes later, the horizon filled with ships. He had found the Kido Butai. And he had arrived at the perfect moment. The Japanese carriers were in the middle of launching operations. Their flight decks were packed with aircraft fueled and armed for the strike against the American fleet. The Zeros were all down at sea level, finishing off the torpedo bombers. The sky above the carriers was empty. No fighters. No flak. It was a miracle of timing. At the same moment, Max Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown arrived from a different direction. It was a coordinated attack by accident. McCluskey broke radio silence, "Follow me." He pushed the stick forward. The SBD Dauntless is a steep diver. It drops at a 70-degree angle. The pilots opened their dive brakes, perforated flaps that keep the plane stable. The wind screamed. The altimeter spun unwinding. 15,000 feet. 10,000 feet. 5,000 feet. Below them, the yellow flight decks of the Japanese carriers grew larger. They could see the red circle of the rising sun painted on the decks. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo looked up. He saw the black shapes of the American planes falling from the zenith. It was too late to turn. It was too late to launch fighters. The amateurs had caught the samurai with their swords sheathed. The first bomb missed. The second bomb missed. The third bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Dick Best, did not miss. It smashed through the flight deck of the Akagi and exploded in the hangar. Remember the piles of torpedoes? The fueled planes? The bombs stacked against the bulkheads? The Akagi didn't just explode, it disintegrated from the inside out. A chain reaction of secondary explosions ripped the heart out of the Japanese flagship. Simultaneously, other bombs hit the Kaga and the Soryu. The Kaga took 4 hits. The Soryu took 3. In the span of 5 minutes, from 10:25 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., the Imperial Japanese Navy went from being the masters of the Pacific to a burning wreck. 3 of their 4 carriers were turning into infernos. The mockery, the laughter, the arrogance, it was all consumed by the fire. The ocean, which just moments before had been a parade ground for the Emperor's fleet, was now a graveyard. 10:25 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942. Naval historians often point to these 5 minutes as the most decisive moment in the history of naval warfare. Before 10:25, Japan was winning the war. After 10:30, Japan was losing it. The devastation on the Japanese carriers was total. On the Akagi, the flagship, just 1 bomb had turned the hangar deck into a furnace. The fuel lines ruptured, feeding the fire. The stacked torpedoes, which Nagumo had ordered reloaded, began to cook off. Admiral Nagumo, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, stood on the bridge in shock. He watched his mighty ship dying beneath his feet. He refused to leave until his staff physically dragged him to a safety rope to transfer to a cruiser. On the Kaga, the fires were even worse. A bomb had landed directly on the bridge, killing the captain and most of the senior officers instantly. The ship was a floating torch. On the Soryu, the damage was catastrophic. The ship was abandoned within 20 minutes. Only the Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive Admiral Yamaguchi, had escaped the initial onslaught. She was hidden by a cloud bank. Yamaguchi launched a desperate counterattack. His dive bombers found the USS Yorktown. They hit her hard. Then his torpedo bombers found her again, thinking it was a different carrier because the damage control crews had fixed her so fast. The Yorktown was eventually sunk by a Japanese submarine, but she absorbed the blows that might have sunk the other American carriers. But the Americans struck back. Late in the afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu. They pummeled her with bombs. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning hulks. The Kido Butai, the invincible fleet that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was gone. The shock to the Japanese system was profound. Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, stared at the radio reports in disbelief. He had set a trap for the Americans, but the trap had snapped on his own fingers. He realized the magnitude of the disaster. He considered rushing his battleships forward to force a night engagement, where his big guns would have the advantage. But he knew that when the sun rose, the American planes would return. And without air cover, his precious battleships would be sitting ducks. With a heavy heart, he ordered the retreat. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The expansion of the Japanese Empire had reached its high-water mark. From this day forward, Japan would be fighting a defensive war. The loss of the four aircraft carriers was a strategic disaster. Ships take years to build. Steel is precious. But the true catastrophe for Japan was not the loss of the ships. It was the loss of the men. When the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu went down, they took with them the heart and soul of the Imperial Navy's air arm. Hundreds of veteran pilots died, some in the air, but many more trapped in the ready rooms or in their bunks when the fires started. But even worse was the loss of the ground crews. The mechanics, the armorers, the technicians. These were men with 10 years of experience. They could service a zero in minutes. They knew every bolt and wire. Thousands of them perished in the hangar deck infernos. Japan could build new carriers, though never enough. They could build new planes. But they could not build new men. The Japanese training system was rigid and slow. It produced a trickle of excellent pilots, not the flood required for total war. The American system was different. The U.S. Navy rotated its best pilots home. They became instructors. They taught the new recruits everything they knew. The thatch weave, the deflection shooting, the survival tactics, this knowledge was passed down. The Japanese kept their aces on the front line until they died. Their knowledge died with them. After Midway, the quality of the Japanese naval aviator began a steep decline. The Turkey shoot of the Philippine Sea in 1944 was a direct result of Midway. The green Japanese pilots were slaughtered because the veterans who could have taught them were at the bottom of the Pacific. Midway didn't just sink for ships, it decapitated the Imperial Navy. In the United States, the victory at Midway was headline news. Navy smashes Jap fleet. It was the first clear-cut victory of the war. It vindicated the Navy. It proved that the Americans could fight. In Japan, there was silence. The government could not admit the truth. To admit that the invincible Kido Butai had been destroyed would shatter public morale. So, they lied. The radio announced a great victory. They claimed to have sunk 2 American carriers while losing only one of their own, and damaging another. The victory march played on the radio. The citizens of Tokyo celebrated, unaware that their protective wall had crumbled. But the cover-up went deeper. The survivors of the sunk carriers were treated not as heroes, but as prisoners. When they arrived back in Japan, they were smuggled ashore at night. They were isolated in hospitals and barracks. They were forbidden from contacting their families. They were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. Many of the wounded were sent to remote bases in the Pacific to die in obscure battles so they couldn't talk. Even Prime Minister Tojo was not initially told the full extent of the disaster. This culture of denial rotted the Japanese war effort from the inside. Because they couldn't admit defeat, they couldn't learn from it. They didn't improve their damage control techniques. They didn't change their codes, until much later. They didn't overhaul their pilot training program. They continued to fight the war as if they were winning, while the reality was that they were slowly bleeding to death. The lie of Midway became a cancer that prevented the Japanese military from adapting to the changing reality of the war. The Battle of Midway did more than just turn the tide of World War II. It changed the nature of naval warfare forever. For centuries, the measure of a navy was the battleship. The ship of the line. The dreadnought. Admirals dreamed of the big gun duel. Midway proved that the dream was dead. In the greatest naval battle in history, the opposing fleets never saw each other. They were never within 200 miles of each other. The battleships, including the mighty Yamato, fired their guns only at aircraft, never at another ship. The aircraft carrier emerged as the undisputed king of the ocean. The ability to project power over hundreds of miles, to strike the enemy before he could even see you, was the new currency of power. The American admirals, who had been forced to rely on carriers at Pearl Harbor out of necessity, now embraced them by choice. The U.S. industrial machine switched gears. They cancelled the construction of the Montana-class battleships. Instead, they built the Essex-class carriers. Dozens of them. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was no longer just a navy, it was a mobile air force that could go anywhere and destroy anything. The Japanese admirals who had mocked the flat-tops spent the rest of the war hiding from them. They had clung to the past, to the samurai sword and the battleship, while the Americans embraced the future of radar, code breaking, and air power. The legacy of Midway is visible today in every modern navy. The aircraft carrier battle group is the primary instrument of global power projection. It started here, on a patch of ocean in the middle of nowhere, where a handful of dive bomber pilots turned the world upside down in 5 blazing minutes. The Japanese mocked the American carriers. But in the end, it was the carriers that wrote the epitaph of the Imperial Japanese Navy.